Hey Geekscapists, it's Tessa Markle again, one half of the team at Femme Regard Production, on the 25th anniversary of Hey Arnold, and talk about one of my favorites, because Hey Arnold was such a cool show. It allowed kids to relate in a way that other shows didn't at the time. You know, I grew up in suburbia, so a lot of the shows were geared towards white kids growing up in suburbia, middle class, just your average kid. So I related to a lot of the shows that were on TV. But Hey Arnold gave something to the urban kids that grew up in a city, that grew up in a boarding house, even an apartment. I mean, apartments were such a unique thing to see on TV for kids at that time. It allowed a lot of kids to finally be able to see themselves represented on TV. And what was really cool is that Hey Arnold kind of allowed the city to be its own character. There's so many cities in our country, let alone in the world, that really have their own character. You think of New York City, and just that term, New York City, has its own vibe, let alone you get into the neighborhoods of Manhattan versus Brooklyn, and they've all got their own personality. And the city in Hey Arnold really had its own personality too, which is funny because they never tell you what the city is. And, they could have made up their own name for the city, but I think they really just wanted it to be kind of in every city, that any urban kid could relate to, which is pretty cool. The other cool thing about Hey Arnold is that the characters were archetypes, but they were also fully fleshed out characters. For instance, you've got Arnold, who's the cool kid, but he's not like the jock or too cool for school. He was just a genuinely good, smart guy who was pretty chill. And then you've got Helga, which there's a lot to unpack with Helga. She's kind of the tomboy bully, but at the same time, she's got this incredible soft side where, she pines for Arnold and says this amazing, eloquent poetry that she writes herself. And, she's actually arguably one of the most intelligent students in that class. But because her older sister Olga is so perfect, as we see in certain episodes, she really has to fight that to get the attention that she wants and needs. So, these characters are kind of complicated. But one of my personal favorite things about the show Hey Arnold is that I learned so much cultural and historical things from that show, and it never felt like I was being taught. And there were some great educational kids shows on at the time, like Wishbone, Magic School Bus, Bill Nye the Science Guy. They were all super fun shows, but you knew you were being taught something when you watched those shows. Versus Hey Arnold, it just seemed like a lot of fun, and yet there's so many things that I learned about, which we'll get into with some specific episodes. Before we jump into specific episodes, though, there is one other thing I'd like to touch upon, which is I think I didn't appreciate it as much as a kid because I didn't know as many of the references. As an adult, I think is really fun is the adults in Hey Arnold and how many of them are just references to or making fun of famous people. You've got Dino Spumoni, who I still sing his songs to this day. But, he's that lounge singer that's kind of washed up, but, once used to be everybody's favorite. Now he can't even get a gig, And then you've got Mr. Simmons, who's the elementary school teacher, who is so obviously a play on Richard Simmons. I think his actual name is Robert Simmons, something like that, I want to say. But you get, like the kids, who are, fully fleshed out versions of these stereotypes and archetypes. You get these intimate, personal, detailed stories with these characters that are references as well. Most of them have their own origin story episode. We learn a lot about Dino in a couple of episodes, especially the one where he and his partner have a big falling out, or the one where he makes everyone think that he's dead, And Mr. Simmons, whenever the kids first meet him, you learn a lot about him, and it's just really cool that they took the time to take these characters that they could have just easily left as these archetypes and references and whatever, and really made them unique and fully formed. I don't know, that's pretty advanced, I think, for a kid's show at the time, especially when they're like, 15 minutes an episode? But I would love to get into the episodes now. So, season 1, episode 2, starting off hot. Field trip. It's when the kids go visit the aquarium and they see the turtle, and this is the first time that we're introduced to urban legends in this show, which is like a huge theme. There's always a story that the kids are blowing out of proportion, and then Arnold has to go save a turtle, for instance, or prove that these kids are just totally making all of this up, or that it actually is true. And so this was a cool introduction to that, because I feel like, again, growing up in suburbia, like, you've got ghost stories, or you've got the urban legends that everybody knows, like Sasquatch and UFOs and, all of those things that are like just a collective urban legend for our entire country. But something that's really cool about especially urban communities is they genuinely do have urban legends, This was a great example of how reality doesn't always live up to the legend. And it was also a really great introduction to Grandma, because she's one of my favorite characters. And this is one of my favorite episodes that she's in, because it just shows how wacky she is, but like still in touch with reality enough. I don't know. I love it. I think she's a lot of fun. The next episode is the infamous Stoop Kid episode. If you don't say Stoop Kid's afraid to leave his stoop at least like 3 times a year in reference to anything, you didn't grow up in the 90s. Like, that is such a famous quote that has been said a million times by a million kids that grew up in this era. I don't know what the secret sauce is to this episode that really made it so popular. I don't know, it might be the most quoted Hey Arnold or Nicktoon episode ever. So a few episodes later, season 1, episode 7, The Vacant Lot. I think this was a really great episode that showed that the adults weren't always right. Because, as a kid, you just assume that adults are like a different species. Like they have all the answers. And like, maybe the kids are sometimes smarter, but like the adults are just always right. And this episode really showed that like, the adults don't know what the heck they're doing either. And as an adult now, I'm always like, where are the adultier adults? Like, what? I'm supposed to always be right now? I'm supposed to have all the answers? So I think this was a really cool episode to point that out, that like sometimes the kids are actually right. Sometimes the kids actually do know better, especially now and, in the political climate that we're living in. Like, the younger generations are kind of coming up with all the answers, or at least all the arguments that could eventually lead us to the answers. So this is a really important episode, I think, and I think it was kind of ahead of its time. Season 1, episode 9, The Haunted Train. This is one of my favorites. I remember it being so spooky when I was a kid watching it, and I just did a rewatch of all of these, and it's so quick, but I remember as a kid, when that episode came on, it felt like it was like a 2-hour movie, and I was so sucked in, and it was so scary. And that is exactly what those urban legends probably felt like to those kids, And if you didn't catch on, this is another episode of urban legends and how they don't necessarily live up. I really suggest going back and rewatching. I don't want to spoil it for you, because the way that this urban legend doesn't live up to the legend is pretty funny. Also, how I learned what sulfur smells like. And one last thing I'd like to mention about that episode, being from Pittsburgh, I mean, is there anything more Pittsburghy than what the train actually leads to? Now you definitely need to rewatch. Season 1, episode 11, Arnolds Christmas. I think this is a really cool episode for, again, kids who live in urban communities, but especially apartment buildings and boarding houses like Arnold did. I guess a boarding house pretty much just is an apartment, right? I mean, I'm still not totally clear on that, but I had never heard of anyone that I knew living in a boarding house when I was growing up. And even apartments, just where I came from, where I grew up, there was not really, everybody I knew kind of lived in a house, and maybe it was a small house, but I don't know, that was kind of foreign to me. So I feel like this is an episode that was pretty cool for kids that did grow up like that to get to see, and especially immigrant kids or kids from immigrant families, because the whole story really centers around Mr. Quinn and his story about his daughter and having to be separated from her to give her a better life. And it's a tearjerker. It really is. But it was probably such a special episode for those kids who never got to see that in any other show. And it's also a great lesson for kids that didn't know that that was a thing, that some kids had to be separated from their parents in order for them to have a safe life. It's a really sweet and bittersweet episode, and that one actually took up a whole half-hour segment, which I think it needed to. So to wrap up season 1, episode 15, The Pigeon Man. This was an episode that always felt like it was a reference to something, but I didn't know what. So I finally looked it up, and it is a loose reference on the Birdman of Alcatraz, which is not a story that I knew then or even know now, to be quite honest. But it just felt like a familiar character, weirdly enough. There's also this big fan theory that at the end of the episode, when the Pigeon Man flies away, that he's actually committing suicide. This is a downer of an episode. I'll be honest, it's got a very bittersweet, I don't know, it's hard to describe. It's not a fun, high energy episode like most of them are, so I think that's possible. I think maybe that would be a little too dark for the creators to put that on kids, but I don't know. Who knows what they really intended? I think it's cool that Hey Arnold sprinkled episodes like that in, because at the point when Hey Arnold came out, I was still a little kid. I was still watching cartoons, but I was on the older side of that. So I was starting to grasp a lot of more adult concepts, And I think that a lot of times we don't give kids enough credit for how advanced they are and how much they do understand these mature concepts. So, Hey Arnold tackled a few of those, and they didn't go in depth with it. They didn't make it obvious, but I think it's pretty cool that they sprinkled those in. Next season, episode 7, Arnold's Halloween. It's an obvious reference to Orson Welles' War of the World in 1939, and I think it's hilarious because they never actually mention that, I don't believe, in that episode, but I could easily see them mentioning that it happened and still it happening again, because I could easily see that happening again in our world now, even though it already did. Anyway, watch the episode. It's a lot of fun. Season 2, episode 15, Harold's Bar Mitzvah. Great introduction to Jewish culture for non-Jewish kids. Personally, I knew about Passover and Hanukkah already thanks to the Rugrats. But, I wasn't super familiar about what all goes into a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, other than it happens when you're 13 and then you're considered a man or a woman. But I like how, the rabbi in the beginning, sprinkles in the Hebrew words and also translates them, but it doesn't feel like he's sitting down giving Harold a lecture on what these words are. It really shows kids the impact and importance of a bar mitzvah, because I don't know, there's a few cartoons that have references to the kids' bar mitzvahs, and it always seems like it's a really terrifying, stressful thing. And I'm curious, for actual, live Jewish kids, is it as scary as it seems? I would love to hear from you guys. Season 2, episode 17, What's Opera? So this was my first introduction to the actual operas, what their names were, what songs were from what the stories were, because, you know, I had grown up hearing all of these songs. They're all not just classical, but like classical classics. You know, they're the songs that are played so many times. You know exactly how they go, but you don't know which opera they're from, or the name of the song, or the story of the opera that they're from. So this was a cool way to learn about that. And I love how they made the songs their own. You know, they didn't just plop the kids into the story, like they rewrote the songs. That was pretty creative. Kudos to the creators there. So season 3, episode 3, when Mr. Quinn goes country. I love this episode. Randy Travis sang for Mr. Quinn. I rewatched this episode and that song was stuck in my head for like 3 days. It's a catchy tune. I could easily see that on the radio. But it was a pretty cool peek into show business, you know, like how quickly someone can have a hit, get famous, the craziness of what it's like to be a famous person, and why a lot of people just don't want that. You know, Mr. Wynn just wanted the simple things. Spicy chicken wings. You get the idea. Season 3, episode 10, Helga and the Nanny. I think this was a really good episode for kids whose parents aren't necessarily there all the time, or kids who feel that their parents aren't paying attention to them. Because through the entire series, that's Helga's parents, right? They dote over her older sister, Olga. They just don't really pay any attention to her at all. Her mom is clearly just depressed. Her dad is obsessed with his work. You know, Helga doesn't really get any of the attention she deserves. So in this episode, she gets stuck with the nanny, and she hates it. And she hates the cultural difference and the personality difference. And of course, you know, in the end, she learns some lessons and learns to deal with it, and, you know, feels bad for the things that she said and did. But I think it was just, yeah, it was a good episode for kids to be able to relate to, because again, it's not, things like that are not really always shown in kids shows at the time, you know? A lot of parents were either just didn't exist at all, or they were like kind of just perfect, and, you know, the show really just concentrated on the kids, so you didn't get that drama, you know, in a lot of shows. Also, it reminds me a lot of the show White Swan. I just have to say, I was recently rewatching that show, and yeah, it's very funny to think of the comparison there. So season 4, episode 4, Oscar Can't Read. Personally, I own a cat, and I could not even begin to count the amount of times I have said, "Kitty, kitty, kitty, I want to pet the kitty." Again, if you don't quote that often, you didn't grow up in the 90s. I do think, again, it's a really important episode, because for kids who either English was a second language for them, or they're illiterate, or whose, you know, parents were illiterate or didn't speak English, you know, again, not something we saw on TV a lot of the time. So it's a really good episode for those kids to get to see that representation and relate to, which, if you haven't caught on, is a big theme with me with Hey Arnold. It started conversations that other shows weren't having at the time. Plus, I think that episode was a great motivator for kids who were just having a little trouble learning to read. That's all the specific episodes I really want to go into detail about, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention Romeo and Juliet, when the kids performed the play. That taught me certain lines that I still remember to this day from the show. The episode where Phoebe cheats and copies the poem by Emily Dickinson. The episode about Chinese checkers, where we're introduced to Bobby Fischer. The episode about Halley's Comet. I remember watching that episode and thinking, oh my gosh, like, when's the next comet? Like, I have to make sure that I see it every 70 years. What if I'm not alive? I gotta make sure I see it. So, you know, really up the stakes for me as a kid. The episode with Stinky, with the Field of Dreams reference, I think his quote, the voice that he was hearing is, "If you plant it, they will grow," in reference to if you build it, they will come. And the episode, actually Matt Kelly texted me about this episode in reference to 12 Angry Men, where the kids have to have a jury debate in school court. And lastly, the episode where Arnold has to sell a bunch of watches because he's been introduced to multi-level marketing. I think Hey Arnold was a really unique show. I think that it tackled a lot of issues that a lot of other shows didn't. It taught kids a lot of lessons and references and just so many things without feeling teachy, which is hard to do, and it just felt so cool. Those city kids were so cool, and it just gave, I think, a lot of kids in a lot of different situations something to relate to. And I will wrap up by saying Arnold's bedroom is my dream room. I mean, he had everything. He had the skylight and roof access. He had the pop-out couch. He had that bomb stereo system. He had the little alien wallpaper. He had it all. He really was the coolest kid. But I highly recommend you go back and rewatch some Hey Arnold episodes because they are a good time. And they're only, 11 to 15 minutes a piece. Maybe you'll be reminded of some things that you forgot that you even knew.